whenever you feel to surrender, it have one little thing that I want you always remember.
7:18 in Trinidad and Tobago. Well, they could start back gambling from this morning, but come next Monday, non-essential retail will finally be able to open its doors following months of restrictions. Remember, they were shut down in May at the height of the spike. Well, the Ministry of Health partnered with the sector a couple of weeks ago to launch a vaccination drive. And on Saturday, Health Minister Terence Dialsingh stressed the importance of employees taking full advantage of the opportunity. He's been describing, in fact, on Saturday, Minister Dialsingh described the take-up within the last week as abysmal as far as vaccinations. Well, let's hear from our guest, Martin George, President of the Tobago Business Chamber, and Vivek Charan, President of the San Juan Business Association. We'll be joined by Mr. Charan in a moment. But let's hear from Martin George, attorney at law as well. Mr. George, your perspective on the vaccine take-up, at least from an employer point of view in the Sister Isle.
Well, Fazil, I think the statistics speak for themselves. And we saw where even the Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly lamented the fact that even amongst health workers in Tobago, it was 53%. So, I mean, that tells you, I mean, if these are the persons who are on the front lines and they're the ones who are putting their lives at risk every day, and they are not taking up the opportunity to be vaccinated as much as we would have thought they would, then that tells you that we really do have a challenge in our hands. So I saw that even the president of the Hotel Association in Tobago, Miss Caroline Bertrand James, she herself was, raising the issue that I had canvassed over the last couple of days as to whether the government needs to consider the question of mandatory vaccinations. It's always going to be a flashpoint for you, and it's always going to be a source of tremendous argument in terms of the pros and cons. But let's think of it in a historical context for you. The smallpox epidemic, which ravaged the world and killed millions of people all over, that required in the UK since 1853. Okay, so you're talking about more than a century ago. 1853, they had to pass vaccination legislation because even though the smallpox vaccine was created in 1796 by Edward Jenner, the vaccine hesitancy, it was there in the UK since then. So the point is, even though the vaccine was there as a solution, you had anti-vaccination leagues being formed. You had people protesting. So, it's so interesting to see how history repeats itself and to see how human nature is always very concerned and, I guess, intimidated by what they are not sure about, what they don't know about. So that is understandable. But what happens is that the government then recognizes that, look, for your own good, we have to make this mandatory. Now, it doesn't mean that the government in Trinidad and Tobago has to come down with a heavy hand. But we also historically must look at the facts and look at the reality for you, because, as you know, I'm a student of history and of law. I love them both. And even when we look at our legislation, we in Trinidad and Tobago have had legislation on the books for years which mandates vaccinations for primary school children. When you go to public schools, all of us have been through it for you. All of us got our vaccines, when we were small, against smallpox, diphtheria, yellow fever, all the things. So in other words, we already have it there in our law books. So mandatory vaccination is not such a novel or strange or outlandish concept. We all went through it. Let's be realistic. Well, so even if you have to make allowances for persons who, for religious reasons or health reasons or otherwise, may have to apply for exemptions, then by all means, you do so and allow the exemptions in the appropriate case.
Indeed. Well, you obviously, if you're a lawyer, you must be a student of history, because much of the existing legislation in Trinidad and Tobago predates the First World War. So you have to be a student of history. That's where we are in Trinidad and Tobago. But let's get to Mr. Vivek Charan, head of the San Juan Business Association. Mr. Charan, do you endorse that perspective of if people continue to remain hesitant and they don't trust the vaccines and so on, to make it mandatory to facilitate the proper reopening of our economy? Good morning to you, Mr. Charan.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me on. Fazil, we are at a very critical and dangerous point. I've been listening to the conversations that are happening in the media and what people are posting on social media as well too. And I believe that the conversation is the wrong conversation to have. We are talking about vaccine and civil liberties, and people are blaming, are saying mandatory vaccination is going to take away my civil liberties and my freedom, when the truth is that COVID is the thing that has taken away our freedom. We can't even go and visit loved ones. We can't even go to the beach. Basic liberties. You can't even run ball in the savannah. COVID has taken away our basic civil liberties and our right to assemble and see people and to open business. That is the problem here. COVID is not mandatory vaccination. We are very happy to be out on the 16th. Thank God we're out on the 16th. And the workers that are working for us, they're so happy to be out on the 16th too. But the situation here is that not that vaccinated people are a risk to unvaccinated people, or unvaccinated people are a risk to vaccinated people. That is not what is an issue. What is an issue here is the population of unvaccinated people, and the data that is relevant to Trinidad and Tobago, not to America or the UK, but what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago, that the MOH has put out, which is saying that over 90% and over 80-something% of the cases that come into the 90-something% of the people that don't make it into the ICU or the HCU are vaccinated people, and 90-something% of the people who are not dying are vaccinated people. And that means that the greater the population of unvaccinated people out there, it is the greater risk that they're taking upon themselves. So fine, if you don't want to take the vaccine, don't take the vaccine. But what does it mean to not take the vaccine? Taking the vaccine is not a political stance. Not taking the vaccine is not a civil liberty stance. Not taking the vaccine means that you're putting yourself and your family members who are not vaccinated at a greater risk to going into the HCU and ICU and not making it back out. And those are the facts. Not taking the vaccine means that a population of people out there is putting at risk the reopening of the economy, putting at risk people coming back to their jobs, putting at risk people, children going back to school, putting at risk businesses being shut down and never opening ever again. That is what is at risk here.
But Mr. Charan, if you'd allow me to ask the question.
Sorry.
If you'd allow me to ask the question, you said the issue is not whether vaccine should be mandatory or not, but you seem to be presenting the exact case as to why it should be mandatory. Because if it is that people continue to remain skeptical, then based on what you are saying, it has to be made mandatory.
Right, but the thing is, Fazir, we're trying to communicate and let people understand what is at stake here. And what is at stake here primarily is your life and the life of your family members. After that, what is at stake here is the economy. What is at stake here is business. What is at stake here is jobs. About whether or not your children will ever leave the house ever again and live a normal life. About whether daycares are going to open and preschools are going to open and parents can come back out to work. I mean, COVID is slowly destroying the social fabric and the economic fabric of our nation, Trinidad and Tobago. And the only way out of that is through vaccination. And the critical point here about mandatory vaccination is this. If it is that we reach a situation, we reopen and everyone says, you know what, I want natural immunity and I don't want to take the vaccine, fine. But if that population of unvaccinated is large enough, when we reopen fully, as the push keeps coming, because people are suffering, they're suffering from workers and people who don't have jobs and not being able to put food on the table, to people who are wondering about whether they're going to be homeless, to watching rent arrears keep raising, to the bank knocking at your door. I had to take a moratorium myself. I know what I'm talking about. When my staff goes out to work, I go out with them. I'm not a miles away in some huge conglomerate or something like that. Whatever risk they take, and when they face COVID outside, I facing COVID outside 7 days a week too, because I ride there inside. And so people who home and making money, I'm glad for them. I'm very happy for them. I'm not one of those people. But my point here is about bed space. My point here is about when we reopen and we reopen fully, because the country is asking for that. Not just the vaccinated or not just business. The country is saying, we want to open fully. We want to get back to our lives. Fine. Let's get back to our lives. And when we get back to our lives and we see those spikes again, and suddenly an announcement comes on at some press conference, we have 10 days of bed space left, and after that, the system is overrun. Then what? Then where do we go from there? Then we end up back into a cycle of open and lockdown and restrictions, and it keeps going on and on and on.
And let me go across, if you would allow me now, Mr. Charan, just to go to Martin George, because the reality is, Mr. George, that yes, everything that both yourself and Mr. Charan seem to be saying makes a lot of sense. But there are many others who are equally convinced about their own position. And they say it's not about calling us lunatics or calling us just simply anti-vaxxers or whatever it is. But the reality is, Mr. George, given the strength of feeling about this, given what we saw in St. Vincent with the attack on the Prime Minister, given the protests in Barbados, I think there was some disturbance in Antigua as well. We've heard a comment from this Grenada Prime Minister about this whole situation. Are you fearful, Martin George, about the emotions of this situation getting out of control?
Well, Fazir, the point is, I mean, it's a very emotive topic, and it's something that will always generate discussion and heated debate one way or the other. Thankfully, Trinidad and Tobago does not have a history of violent protests. So, I mean, the point is, I think the most we do is, we will talk about it, we may quarrel, we may complain, we go to the, the corner and we talk, and let people vent. But I don't think that we are going to reach to that stage. And, it's something that no one wants to wish upon this country. But the emotions are real. And, the same way that, of course, listening to my colleague there, speak, with such passion, there are those who speak with equal passion against being vaccinated. But sometimes as a government, you have to show that strength of leadership and take the difficult decision and bite the bullet. And as I said, historically, you look back and see what happened in the UK. They had to make the vaccination mandatory for smallpox because they recognized that, look, despite all their urgings, the population was not responding. Similarly, we have mandatory vaccinations already in place for primary school children going to public schools, and nobody complains about that. So let's understand that when you peel away the emotive layers and you get down to the brass tacks, you look at the facts. Look, last Friday, Dr. Fauci announced in the US that the 100 million Americans who are unvaccinated, they present the greatest threat to the economic, social well-being of the country. And he also said that they are a health risk. He actually came out and said so. So, the statistics are there. 99.5% of the persons who are contracting the disease now are the unvaccinated. So, the math is fairly simple. So when we move the emotions off the table and we look at the cold, hard facts, I think it's indisputable that, look, the vaccination is the only solution. And I think that's where you then get people coming to understand. Now, I still think, Fazil, that the government needs to do more in terms of a persuasive effort. So in other words, while you may want to go the full route of the mandatory vaccination, I think more needs to be done in terms of the marketing, the advertising campaign to persuade people. As I say, you have Barack Obama, you have Michelle Obama, you have Ice-T, you have all these people, John Legend, encouraging folks to be vaccinated. So in Trinidad and Tobago, we could do the same. We could try to use our stars, use, Kes, Marshall, all these people, let them, do some promotions, try to reach the public. So you go with both approaches. You both have the carrot to encourage people, and for those who just are, totally obstinate for no reason, then you have to use the stick of the mandatory vaccination. So you use a double-pronged approach, but you make it clear that persuasion is the best option as opposed to the mandatory vaccination. But in other words, if you need to, and I think the Prime Minister spoke in terms similar to this, when he couched his language and saying, well, if the government has to, they will take certain steps. So, but of course, it is a challenging and difficult step to take because of the reactions that they will get. But sometimes leadership requires that. And if you look at it, if we do, previously our problem was we didn't have vaccines. Now we have vaccines, but we don't have the uptake. So then what's the point of having the vaccines? The vaccines have an expiry date, so therefore you can't keep them too long, otherwise they're going to be expired. So in other words, what are we to do? Are we going to sit down on our 800,000 doses and sit down and watch them expire while people come up with, some absurd and inane theories, that it was designed to kill black people, or, you will die in 3 years, or, come on, Fazil. We really have to have logical, sensible, mature, rational discourse on it and look at the science, look at the logic, look at the facts, and then clearly, I think it would be obvious to us that we have to take some kind of decision as to whether we should legislate to vaccinate.
And Mr. Charan, where do you see things going? Because I understand Mr. George's point about taking the emotion of the table, but that is easier said than done. And even if the government were to legislate, that might make people even more obstinate by saying that the government trying to force me to do something. They might say, is this North Korea? Is this a totalitarian state? What is your sense as to how this is going? In other words, do you get the sense that the ordinary people with whom you interact, whether they be your employees or others in the general community, are inclined to take the vaccine?
No, they're not inclined, and I agree with Mr. George. I think that we should have led by example. And it would have been great to have seen in the early days that every single member of cabinet, opposition and government in power roll up their sleeves and take the jab. And every single MP all over go on social media and show that they're taking the jab, whatever it is, AstraZeneca or Sinopharm. It's going to be a long while before we get vaccine by buffet style. I would have liked to take how many other vaccines? I didn't. I took the vaccine that was available at the time. And I at the root of this thing is fear. And when people fear something, they're capable of anything in a sense, but it's difficult to get them out of that fear zone no matter who says what. But if that population of unvaccinated doesn't shrink, then it's inevitable that we're going to be locked down again. And it's inevitable that bars are going to be closed. You're not going to see beaches and rivers for a long time, and schools are going to be closed and so on. But my advice is to the government and to the MOH that if that happens and that pool of unvaccinated, that large population of unvaccinated does not shrink, then in the next lockdown that is sure to come, do not have essential and non-essential. Please change the Public Health Act to say vaccinated businesses and vaccinated workers could open and stay open, and unvaccinated people could stay at home and look after themselves and protect themselves until something better happens or something that they're more comfortable with happens to prevent that, to keep them safe and to prevent bed space and prevent the hospitals from being overrun. Because we cannot go back to a lockdown situation with essential and non-essential, because small business can't keep taking those hammer blows all the time. And people and workers can't keep coming on and working for 2 months and staying home for 2 months. Any lockdown after this has to be vaccinated come out, unvaccinated lockdown. It can't be a vaccinated lockdown after this. And that would be my plea to the government, and I think that makes logical sense.
No, it does. It does indeed. It does indeed. And, I mean, Fazil, that's what is happening in Italy, in France, in New York, in California. They are making that distinction. They are saying, look, if you choose not to be vaccinated, then you will not be able to enter bars, restaurants, whatever. You will not be able to go to the cinema, because the point is you present a systemic risk. And that's the reality. So, I mean, the point is we need to understand the importance of taking these tough decisions and taking them now. Because, I mean, the thing is, if we have another lockdown for zero, there are many businesses that will never, ever see the light of day again. And that's the reality.
And before we conclude, gentlemen, if you would allow me, so sorry to interrupt you, Martin George, but I just want to ask you quickly, and I'll ask Mr. Charan the same thing, that if it were to go that way, we've already seen it happen with the bubble in Trinidad and Tobago, with the fake vaccination cards and so on. Aren't you just simply creating another industry, another sideline by making that mandatory? I just have to get a few blue notes and I will get a certified card from whichever friend I have in the health ministry.
Well, I mean, it's something that will have to be policed and monitored, because it's actually a problem that is beginning to emerge worldwide. Even in the US, they are facing the same thing with fraudulent vaccination cards and fraudulent vaccination IDs and all kinds of things. So it's something we will have to clamp down on. We'll have to monitor it. We'll have to be very stringent in terms of how we deal with it. We may have to have maybe a standardized system to show that, look, yes, this is the genuine thing. But the point is, we can't let that be our obstacle to say that we're not going to try to ensure that we get as wide as possible participation in the vaccination.
And Mr. Charan, a final thought from you on that. Is this going to be a recipe for even more chaos with corruption as far as people being certified as vaccinated if they were to allow to be in wider society?
Well, Fazil, no matter how many vaccine cards they fake, at the end of the day, COVID coming for you and you're not vaccinated, you're going to end up in the hospital. Or you're going to end up facing the worst effects of the virus. And that is not me wishing that upon anybody. That is just a matter of fact. And we've seen that happen after Easter, when we had up to 20 deaths a day. You have to understand the continual pressure that has been on the hospital and medical system for more than a year and a half now. It's been very, very difficult for those people. And it's going to continue to be difficult for them, for doctors, for nurses, for everybody in that healthcare system that continually have to look after the people in the HCU and ICU and try to get them healthy and try to stop them from dying. And that's what they're facing. And I'm pretty sure, as we've seen in many cases, that many of the people who end up in the HCU and ICU gasping for breath and wondering if they're ever going to see their loved ones again, because their loved ones can't come in there to see them. And if they feel that they're going to pass out or whatever and never see the light of day, at that point in time, if they were to ask themselves, should I have taken the vaccine? Of course they would have taken the vaccine.
That's right.
Of course they would have taken the vaccine.
That's correct. That's
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to be with us this morning. We'll see how things unfold, because clearly, as you said, there's a lot of emotion, but it certainly needs to be separated from the hard facts of this situation. Martin George and Vivek Charan of the business community, one in Tobago, one in San Juan, giving us a perspective there. Before we go to the break, we've received the sad news from Antigua Barbuda of the passing of the former Prime Minister, the second Prime Minister of Antigua Barbuda, Lester Bird, former athlete as well. He was a former long jumper competing in the collegiate system in the United States before he moved into politics. He has passed away this morning, announced by his family in Antigua at the age of 83. No doubt there'll be more information on that during the course of the day and in the news as well tonight. As we go to the break, here's an image captured at King Peter's Bay in Tobago with a beautiful rainbow. And now a couple images from a viewer captioned that they planted these just for the honeybees. Very generous to ensure that the honeybees will have something to pollinate and maybe have some honey as well that you'll be able to enjoy as we go to the break.
Now the treasury flat